All right, today we're jumping into one of the most contentious topics out there, the idea of warfare in the Quran. We're going to be using Dr. Joel Hayward's deep dive analysis to unpack those verses that always spark debate, and, more importantly, the context that so often gets left behind. Let's get into it.
So, this is the one. This is the verse that sits right at the heart of the whole debate. It's known as the verse of the sword, and it's probably the single most quoted scripture by critics who argue that Islam is inherently aggressive. I mean, it's powerful, it seems crystal clear, and if you read it all by itself, it's pretty shocking.
But is it the whole story? That's the big question, right? And it's the central question that this analysis really forces us to confront. Because whenever a single line is used to define an entire religion's view on something as complex as war, you've got to suspect there's a bigger picture. So, here's our game plan. We're going to start with that controversial verse of the sword. Then, we'll get into the absolutely crucial principle of context. After that, we'll look at the broader rules of war in the Quran, tackle that widely misunderstood word jihad, and finally, wrap it all up with the author's conclusions.
Okay, so the source tells us that for many critics, this verse, along with another one from the same chapter, is pretty much Exhibit A. The argument they make is that these verses are basically a standing order, a blanket command for Muslims to wage war on anyone who won't submit to Islamic rule. But right away, the author hits us with a crucial idea: context. The central thesis of the whole monograph is that you simply cannot understand these verses in a vacuum. The real meaning is locked into the specific historical moment, the when and the why, and the verses that surround them.
And to really get this debate, you have to understand this key term, abrogation, or naskh in Arabic. It's the principle that a later revelation can update or even replace an earlier one, especially when it comes to legal rulings. And believe me, how you interpret this one concept changes, well, pretty much everything.
So, depending on how you see this one idea, you end up in two completely different places. The critical view says that the later, more aggressive-sounding verses revealed in the city of Medina simply erase all the earlier peaceful verses from Mecca. But the author, and many scholars, argue that's not it at all. They say abrogation only clarifies specific rules for specific situations, while the core universal messages about peace and ethics remain totally intact.
So what was that specific context for the sword verse? Well, according to the source, it wasn't just some random command. It came down right after a crucial peace treaty had been broken by hostile tribes. In response, a 4-month amnesty was declared, giving those groups a chance to back off or leave peacefully. So the verse wasn't a call for a surprise attack, it was a final warning, and it was aimed at a very specific goal, purifying the holy site of Mecca, and it was literally surrounded by verses commanding mercy for anyone who stopped fighting or asked for protection.
Okay, so if the verse of the sword was a very specific response to a crisis, what does the rest of the Quran have to say about war in general? This leads us straight into the broader ethical framework for conflict that the author lays out.
Now, this is a really important point the author makes. The very first time the early Muslim community was given permission to fight, it was only after 14 years of enduring intense persecution, violence, and humiliation. They had practiced non-violent resistance until they were on the brink of being wiped out completely. So the permission wasn't for conquest, it was purely for survival.
And this verse right here just brilliantly sums up the whole principle. Fight those who fight you. It's explicitly defensive, but the second half is just as critical. But do not transgress limits. This introduces the idea of rules, of proportionality, right from the very beginning. You can fight, but it has to be constrained.
So what does transgressing limits actually look like in practice? Well, check out this code, which was compiled by Abu Bakr, the Prophet Muhammad's closest companion and successor. It explicitly forbids killing non-combatants, women, children, the elderly. It forbids mutilating bodies, destroying crops and trees, and harming religious figures. The author presents this as a really clear ethical code, one that looks a lot like the Western concept of jus in bello, or justice in war.
Okay, let's talk about that word everyone thinks they know, jihad. But here's the fascinating thing the source points out. The verse of the sword and all those other verses about combat, they don't even use the word jihad. They use the Arabic word qital, which very specifically means fighting or combat.
So if it's not holy war, what is it? Well, the literal meaning of jihad is simply struggle, exertion, or effort. The source explains it as the struggle against anything that's considered ungodly, whether that's something out in the world or, more importantly, something inside yourself.
It's a way broader concept than just fighting. And this leads to a really crucial distinction. The author points to a famous story where the Prophet Muhammad, returning from a military campaign, told his followers that they had just come from the lesser jihad to the greater jihad. The greater struggle, he explained, is the internal one, that daily, nonviolent fight against your own ego and your own shortcomings. The lesser external struggle can include defensive fighting, sure, but that's just one small piece of a much larger spiritual idea. So where does all of this leave us? Well, the author's conclusion really draws a sharp line in the sand. It creates a stark contrast between the actual doctrine you find in the text and the way it's been distorted and used by extremists today.
So, let's recap the key takeaways from the source. The argument boils down to this. The Quran's framework for war is defensive, not offensive. It has a strict ethical code. Context is everything, and this means that modern extremists who try to justify terrorism are, according to this analysis, completely twisting the text, especially when the Quran itself states very clearly there is no compulsion in religion.
And that brings us to one final big question. If the Quran, as this source argues, lays out a clear framework for just and constrained warfare, one that's based on defense, rules, and mercy, why is there such a massive gap between that text and the way it's so widely perceived today? Now that is something we're thinking about.